And of course, they had ties to Palestine, and particularly to Jerusalem and other places, going back centuries, if not millennia. But the idea of establishing an exclusively Jewish state at the expense of those who are already living there, I think it was right to reject that. And I don't think we can look back now, 75 years later, and say, well...
Oh, God, I would be so evil here. I would pit them against each other. Why did Finklestein say that they should accept it? Because now that might be a 3-on-1. Divide and conquer, just like the colonizers do. Oh, God.
From fairly early on in the conflict, from the 1890s or the early 1900s, said the Jews intend to expel us. This doesn't mean that it's true. It means that some Arabs said this, maybe believing it was true, maybe using it as a political instrument to gain support to mobilize Arabs against the Zionist experiment. But the fact is, transfer did not occur before 1947. And Arabs later said, and since then, have said that the Jews want to build a third temple on the Temple Mount, as if that's what really the mainstream of Zionism has always wanted and always strived for. But this is nonsense. It's something that Husseini used to use as a way to mobilize masses for the cause, using
Mr.
religion
Husseini.
as the way to get them to join him. The fact that Arabs said that the Zionists wanted to dispossess us doesn't mean it's true. It just means that some Arabs thought that, maybe said it sincerely.
Professor Morris.
Later it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is true.
Professor
Because
Morris.
Arabs attacked the Jews.
Professor Morris, I read through your stuff. Even yesterday, I was looking through Righteous Victims.
You should read other things. You're wasting your time.
No, actually, no. I do read other things, but I don't consider it a waste of time to read you. Not at all. You say that
Oh, God.
this wasn't inherent in Zionism. Now, would you agree that David Ben-Gurion was a Zionist?
A major Zionist leader.
Right. Would you agree Chaim Weizmann was a Zionist?
Yeah.
Okay. I
you're gonna
believe they
quote them.
were.
Let's go.
I believe
Quote
they
them.
took their
Let's
ideology
go.
seriously. It was the first
Oh, yeah,
generation.
these aren't even Benny's books, are they? These are Finkelstein's books. I think this is Gaza, in Question to Mars. Yeah. He's quoting from his own, because Birth and Righteous Victims are both too big to be any of these books. They're too chunky.
Just like with the Bolsheviks, the first generation was committed to an idea. By the 1930s, it was just pure realpolitik. The ideology went out the window. The first generation, I have no doubt about their convictions. Okay? They were Zionists. Transfer was inevitable and inbuilt in Zionism.
You keep repeating the same thing.
Because I have, as I said, Mr. Morris, I have a problem reconciling what you're saying. It either was incidental or it was deeply entrenched. Here I read, it's deeply entrenched. Two very resonant words, inevitable and inbuilt.
Deeply entrenched, I never wrote.
Well, I'm not sure.
It's something you just invented.
Okay.
But
Inevitable and inbuilt.
The idea.
Okay.
Let me concede.
Fine,
Let me concede
fine.
something.
No.
The idea of transfer was there. Israel Zangwill, a British Zionist, talked about it early on in the century. Even Herzl, in some way, talked about transferring population.
According to your 25 pages, everybody talked
Well,
about
that's we keep bringing up this line from the 25 pages and the 4 pages.
So he's quoting himself, quoting Morris, yeah.
We're lucky to have Benny in front of us right now. We don't need to go to the quotes. We can legitimately ask, how central is expulsion to Zionism in its early version of Zionism, in whatever Zionism is today?
It's just so interesting, though, that the expulsions only started after a war, was started in a civil war. It's just quite incidental that they didn't do it before that. That before that, although they very much liked the idea of it and no one really spoke against it, generally it seemed to be that when they're talking about transfer, is they're expecting it to happen as a kind of like shared agreement between the Zionists and other Arab leaders, like whether it's Jordan or some shit. Yeah. Did they have the power to do it then? Did the Haganah have the power to start expelling people before the British left? I mean, maybe. I mean, the Zionists had the power to set off fucking massive bombs in in populated cities. So,
And how much power, influence does Zionism and ideology have in Israel, and influence the philosophy, the ideology?
I don't really know why it's a difficult thing to understand, though. The whole argument is that they wanted it to happen. They found it preferential, but they did it in the context of a civil war and then an actual war. Not that they were just sitting there throughout the 30s and everything, just carefully assembling this plan before dropping it in. These are just two slightly different things. I don't know why it's difficult to understand that. And that it would have been a much harder thing to pull off or to justify if the partition plan had been accepted on both sides. That doesn't make it any better. It gets around the argument because it seems to be that Finkelstein and Mouin are saying that even if the partition plan was accepted, the Nakba would have still happened. I don't know why everyone just runs to the fucking moralizing. I'm not trying to say it's better. I'm trying to say there's a factual dispute. Okay? Oh God, because they're trying to say that even if the partition plan had been accepted by both sides, Israel would have still ethnically cleansed 45% of their population in the Jewish state because that's just what they want to do. That's just what's inbuilt to their ideology. But no, like you can have ideas that are very prominent amongst the movement and thoughts and hopes or even some like ambitions, but you also have a material reality that changes the degree to which it's actually likely to happen. And a war does make it quite likely to happen. Okay, fuck. That's why. Oh God, I don't know, fucking.
Have on Israel today.
The Zionist movement up to 1948, Zionist ideology was central to the whole Zionist experience, the whole enterprise up to
Did Palestinians have valid reason to fear displacement? I think as soon as the partition plan was rejected, yes, they did have valid fear of displacement. Yeah.
1948. And I think Zionist ideology was also important in the first decades of Israel's existence. Slowly, the hold of Zionism, like if you like Bolshevism held the Soviet Union, gradually faded. And a lot of Israelis today think in terms of individual success and then the capitalism and all sorts of things which have nothing to do with Zionism. But Zionism was very important. But what I'm saying is that the idea of transfer wasn't the core of Zionism. The idea of Zionism was to save the Jews who had been vastly persecuted in Eastern Europe and incidentally in the Arab world, the Muslim world, for centuries, and eventually ending up with the Holocaust. The idea of Zionism was to save the Jewish people by establishing a state or re-establishing a Jewish state on the ancient Jewish homeland, which is something the Arabs today even deny, that there were Jews in Palestine or the land of Israel 2,000 years ago. Arafat famously said, what temple was there on Temple Mount? Maybe it was in Nablus, which of course is nonsense. But they had a strong connection for thousands of years to the land to which they wanted to return and returned there. They found that on the land lived hundreds of thousands of Arabs. And the question was how to accommodate the vision of a Jewish state in Palestine alongside the existence of these Arab masses living on, who were indigenous, in fact, to the land by that stage. And the idea of partition, because they couldn't live together, because the Arabs didn't want to live together with the Jews. And I think the Jews also didn't want to live together in one state with Arabs in general. The idea of partition was the thing which the Zionists accepted. Okay, we can only get a small part of Palestine. The Arabs will get in 1937 most of Palestine. In 1947, the ratios were changed. But we can live side by side with each other in a partitioned Palestine. And this was the essence of it. The idea of transfer was there, but it was never adopted as policy. But in 1947-48, the Arabs attacked, trying to destroy essentially the Zionist enterprise and the emergent Jewish state. And the reaction was transfer in some way, not as policy, but this is what happened on the battlefield. And this is also what Ben Gurion at some point began to want as well.
Right. Well, one of the first books on this issue I read when I was still in high school, because my late father had it, was the Diaries of Theodor Herzl. And I think, Theodor Herzl, of course, was the founder of the contemporary Zionist movement. And I think if you read that, it's very clear. For Herzl, the model...
He's going to bring up the one quote. Yeah, there's one quote in that diary where he talks about like the need for transfer. Yeah.
On which the Zionist movement would proceed, his model was Cecil Rhodes. I think, Rhodes, from what I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, has quite a prominent place in Herzl's diaries. I think Herzl was also corresponding with him and seeking his support. Cecil Rhodes, of course, was the British colonialist after whom the former white minority regime in Rhodesia was named. And Herzl also says explicitly in his diaries that it is essential to remove the existing population from Palestine.
Can I respond to this?
In a moment, please. He says we shall have to spirit the penniless population across the borders and procure employment for them elsewhere. Or something. And Israel Zangwill, who you mentioned, a land without a people for a people without a land. They knew damn well it wasn't a land without a people. I'll continue, but please go ahead.
Just to this, there is one small diary entry in Herzl's vast...
it's 5 volumes.
Yeah, 5 volumes. There's one paragraph which actually mentions the idea of transfer. There are people who I think that Herzl was actually pointing to South America when he was talking about that. The Jews were going to move.
Oh, I've heard that as well. I was told that by... Which is weird that Benny Morris says that, because I think in his book he brings up the Herzl quote as well, but I think he must have not realized he was talking about South America until later, or he just threw it in anyway, or just shows that it's like... Because obviously Herzl's public speak was very much, we're going to coexist, we're going to be like working together and building up a fucking mutually beneficial state and all, yeah.
Argentina, and then they would try and buy out or buy off or spirit the penniless natives to make way for Jewish settlement. Maybe he wasn't even talking about the Arabs in that particular passage. That's the argument of some people. Maybe he was. But the point is, it has only a 1/100th of 1% of the diary which is devoted to the subject. It's not a central idea in Herzl's thinking. What Herzl wanted, and this is what's important, not Rhodes, I don't think he was the model. Herzl wanted to create a liberal, democratic, Western state in Palestine for the Jews. That was the idea. Not some imperial enterprise serving some imperial master, which is what Rhodes was about, but to have a Jewish state which was modeled on the Western democracies in Palestine. And this, incidentally, was more or less what Weizmann and Ben Gurion wanted. Ben Gurion was more of a socialist. Weizmann was more of a liberal.
Also, I think when you read Ben Gurion, because I think even Ben Gurion like evolved into like wanting transfer during his time in Palestine, because he arrives there in, when's he arrive? Like 1906, 7, 8, something like that. Before 1910, he arrives there. Originally feeling like, how did he describe the Arabs? Very friendly, like big children or some shit. But then obviously, even as soon as he arrives, the boat that he's on is like, kind of gets like gets kind of run by a mob. So he has to get rescued and then taken onto shore by an Arab. And it's over his time in Palestine when he starts to abandon his like ambitions as like kind of fairy dust ideas of coexistence and labor, Zionism, and all that kind of shit. And then he becomes much more into partition and transfer. Yeah.
Westerner, but they wanted to establish a social democratic or liberal state in Palestine. And they both envisioned through most of the years of their activity that there would be an Arab minority in that Jewish state. It's true that Ben Gurion strived to have as small as possible an Arab minority in the Jewish state, because he knew that if you want a Jewish majority state, that would be necessary. But it's not something which they were willing to translate into actual policy.
Just a quick pause to mention that for people who are not familiar, Theodor Herzl we're talking about over a century ago, and everything we've been talking about has...
That was a really misleading connection. Cecil Rhodes with Herzl. Yeah, it's just... I think Mouin Rabbani, I think he might be... Is he a tanky? He definitely talks like they do, but he also has... He had like a thing in his bookshelf that was just like Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, like a little plaque or something, but I don't know. I don't actually know if he is, so we'll just assume he's not. But I notice he uses a lot of the same arguments that they do, like the whole just like... You find a couple of words that make it sound more like, that make it sound as much as possible like standard imperialist settler colonies like Rhodesia or French Algeria or Kenya or anything like that. And then you just try and like build a one-to-one comparison between them and the Zionist movement. It's which is really dishonest, but yeah, whatever.
It's been mostly 1948 and before.
Yes. Just one clarification on Herzl's diaries. I mean, the other thing that I recall from those diaries is he was very preoccupied with, in fact, getting great power patronage, seeing Palestine, the Jewish state in Palestine, I think his words, an outpost of civilization against barbarism.
Yes.
In other words, very much seeing his project as a proxy for Western imperialism in the Middle East.
Right word. Not proxy. He wanted to establish a Jewish state which would be independent. To get that, he hoped that he would be able to garner support from major imperial powers,
including the Ottoman Sultan, who he tried to cultivate. I just want to respond to a point you made earlier, which was that people expressed their rejection of the partition resolution on the grounds that it gave the majority of Palestine to the Jewish community, which formed only a third. Whereas, in fact, if I understood you correctly, you're saying the Palestinians and the Arabs would have rejected any partition resolution.
Yeah. I think a couple things. That one, they would have rejected any. Two, a lot of that land given was in the Negev. It was pretty terrible land at the time. And three, the land that would have been partitioned to Jews, I think would have been, I think I saw it was like 500,000 Arabs. It would have been 500,000 Jews, 400,000 Arabs, and I think like 80,000 Bedouin would have been there. So the state would have been
I think you raise a valid point, because I think the Palestinians did reject the partition of their homeland in principle. And I think the fact that the United Nations General Assembly then awarded the majority of their homeland to the Zionist movement only added insult to injury. I mean, one doesn't have to sympathize with the Palestinians to recognize that they have now been a stateless people for 75 years. Can you name any country, yours, for example, or yours, that would be prepared to give 55%, 25%, 10% of your country to the Palestinians? Of course not. And so the issue was not the existence of Jews in Palestine. They had been there for centuries. And of course, they had ties to Palestine, and particularly to Jerusalem and other places, going back centuries, if not millennia. But the idea of establishing an exclusively Jewish state at the expense of those who were already living there, I think it was right to reject that. And I don't think we can look back now, 75 years later, and say, well...
Oh, God, I would be so evil here. I would pit them against each other. Why did Finklestein say that they should accept it? Because now that might be a 3-on-1. Divide and conquer, just like the colonizers do. Oh, God.
you should have accepted losing 55% of your homeland because you ended up losing 78% of it, and the remaining 22% was occupied in 1967. That's not how things work.
Yeah.
And I can imagine an American rejecting giving 10% of the United States to the Palestinians, and if that rejection leads to war and you lose half your country, I doubt that 50 years from now you're going to say, well, maybe I should have accepted that.
Sure. So I like this answer more than what I usually feel like I'm hearing when it comes to the Palestinian rejection of the 47 partition plan. Because sometimes I feel like a weird switch happens to where the Arabs in the area are actually presented as entirely pragmatic people who are simply doing a calculation and saying like, well, we're losing 55% of our land. Jews are only maybe 1/3 of the people here, and we've got 45. And the math doesn't work basically. But it wasn't a math problem. I think, like you said,
it was a matter of principle.
It was an ideology problem.
No, it was a matter of principle.
Yeah, ideologically driven. That they, as a people, have a right to or are entitled to this land that they've never actually had an independent state on, that they've never had even a guarantee of an independent state on, that they've never actually ruled over.
That last point is actually not correct, because for all its injustice, the mandate system recognized Palestine as a Class A mandate, which provisionally recognized the independence of that territory.
Of what would emerge from that territory, but not of the Palestinian.
It was provisionally recognized.
But not, but the territory itself was, but not of the Palestinian people to have a right or a guarantee to a government that would
it was
emerge
a British mandate of Palestine, not the British mandate of Israel.
The word exclusive, which you keep using, is nonsense. The state which Ben-Gurion envisioned would be a Jewish majority state, as they accepted the 1947 partition resolution, as Stephen said. That included 400,000 plus Arabs in a state which would have 500,000 Jews. So the idea of exclusivity wasn't anywhere in the air at all among the Zionist leaders in 47-48. They wanted a Jewish majority state, but were willing to accept a state which had 40% Arabs. That's one point. The second thing is the Palestinians may have regarded the land of Palestine as their homeland, but so did the Jews. It was the homeland of the Jews as well. The problem was the Arabs were unable and remain to this day unable to recognize that for the Jews, that is their homeland as well. And the problem then is, how do you share this homeland? Either with one binational state or...
I think that's also a problem you get into, is that even because I think I could understand very easily the argument that the origins of Zionism did just try to... It had an unreasonable ask, which was to move and establish a presence on a land that had other people living there that didn't consent to having the land that they lived on given over to another group of people from like Europe. I can understand that argument, but even if you accept that, the fact is that by the time you reach 1947 or even the 30s, you had a problem where there were two national groups living on that land, and both of them, the Jews in particular, had nowhere else to go. People were starting to get born there from like the 1870s onwards. So once you get to that point, then you had to do something and you had to find an agreement. Neither of them wanted to share the state. So partition just made the most sense. Like, I think I can understand that. Like, I think the partition plan in 47, 48, I wouldn't say it was the best answer. I wouldn't word it that way, but the least bad one? Yeah, probably, yeah. There's no way that a 37 or, was it 37 or 33? Anyway, whatever. There's no way that a third of that population being Jewish was going to accept coming under a state with al-Husseini as the fucking leader, right? With a fucking Nazi supporter as the leader. They were never going to accept that. The Arabs were never going to accept, like, they didn't want it either. They didn't want to share the land. So, yeah, partition seemed to be the best compromise there, but yeah.
Separate this partition into two states. The problem is that the Arabs have always rejected both of these ideas. The homeland belongs to the Jews, as Jews feel, as much as it does, if not more, than for the Arabs.
Jews.
I would say for the Jews. It's the Jewish people's
I would also,
homeland.
real quick, I just want for both of you guys, because I haven't heard these questions answered. I really want these questions to be. I'm just so curious how to make sense of them. It was correctly brought up that I believe that Ben-Gurion had, I think Shlomo Ben-Ami describes it as an obsession with getting validation or support from Western states, Great Britain, and then a couple decades later,
That explains the Suez War, the Suez crisis.
Exactly, correct. That was one of the major motivators, the idea to work with Britain and France on a military operation
An imperial
against Arabs.
stooge.
But then the question again I go back to, if that is true, if Ben-Gurion, if the early Israel saw themselves as a Western fashion nation, how could we possibly imagine that they would have engaged in the transfer of some 400,000 Arabs after accepting the partition plan? Would that not have completely and totally destroyed their legitimacy in the eyes of the entire Western world? Would it not have been? How not?
Well, first of all, I think that the Zionists...
Yeah, with no war, like without the cover of war, because again, a lot of what Israel does when it comes to like their worst actions or their most unjustified actions is they do it with the cover of war. That's why in the Six-Day War, on the first day of the Six-Day War, they're already having cabinet meetings where like the issue of Jerusalem is brought up. And by the time they're going through past East Jerusalem and into the West Bank, it's under the cover of war, where you've got people like demolishing as many houses as possible, moving people, like trying to get people in to establish a presence. They're like destroying the bridges from the West Bank to Jordan. Like they're doing all this under the cover of war. And they also, under the cover of war, started preparing for the annexation of East Jerusalem, because they knew that as soon as the international community got wind of what was potentially going to happen, they would have come down on Israel like a ton of bricks. And that's why they made sure to be as subtle as possible when they actually formalized the annexation of East Jerusalem. Would you say the attempt to cleanse the triangle was under the cover of the Suez Canal War? Maybe? Maybe? Or was that not more to do with like the raids that were coming in anyway? I don't know. I don't know if there's any documentation for that, but I know for the annexation of East Jerusalem and the movement of settlers into the West Bank, those two absolutely were. Like, the annexation of East Jerusalem was deliberately done as quickly and as quietly as possible because they wanted to get it done before the international community could step in. That was very important to them. That's why before the Knesset meeting, before the Knesset session where they voted on it, they went around and told a bunch of people to not sing the Israeli national anthem during the session because they wanted it to be low key. Then a couple of Knesset members ended up singing it anyway. But
leadership's acceptance of the partition resolution, and I think you may have written about this, that they accepted it because it provided international endorsement of the legitimacy of the principle of Jewish statehood, and they didn't accept the borders, and in fact later expanded the borders. Second of all,
they expanded the borders during a war. Oh God, that's so slimy. They accepted the borders, and then they decided to change the borders after the other side rejected the borders. And you can get into the ethics of that if you want to. Should Israel have only fought to protect the partition plan borders? I don't know. Okay.
The borders were expanded in war.
They accepted the UN partition resolution, borders and all.
They accepted.
You can say that some of the Zionists, deep in their hearts, had the idea that maybe at some point they would be able to get more.
Including their most senior leaders who said so, and I think you've quoted them saying so.
Because of are borders ever expanded without a war? Yeah, but who started the war?
Okay. Accepted what the United Nations, the world community, had said. This is what.
But yeah, you're right. Like, I don't know what this argument is. Are people saying that if both sides accepted the partition plan, Israel would have expanded their borders and expelled people anyway? Where's the? I don't get that. I feel like. I feel like it's that's why these historians, like, they always relegate the Arabs to a passive role. It's because that's what they want. It's because they think even if they were completely passive, the result would have been exactly the same. Which is very, it's like Western exceptionalism, but for fucking Zionists. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Don't know.
Yes. And second of all, I mean, removing darker people, it's
dark.
It's intrinsic. It's intrinsic.
Jews are as dark as Arabs.
It's intrinsic to what.
It's okay. Oh God, are we doing like a racial assent? They were European, so they were racially bound to expel.
They accepted the UN partition resolution, borders and all.
They accepted.
You can say that some of the Zionists, deep in their hearts, had the idea that maybe at some point they would be able to get more.
Including their most senior leaders who said so, and I think you've quoted them saying so.
But they grudgingly accepted what the United Nations, the world community, had said. This is what you're going to get.
And second of all, I mean, removing darker people, it's intrinsic. It's intrinsic.
This is how I know he has no argument. Okay, thank you. He's confirmed it to me. There's no sufficient number of quotes that you can grab from. There's no documentation. We know. Okay, we know. Because it's in their DNA to fucking get rid of brown people. Okay, nice one. Even though a lot of the Jews who lived there, even before the Mizrahi and North African Jews arrived in Israel, there were I think something like 6 or 7% of the original population of Mandate Palestine in 1917 were brown as well. They were dark as well.
Jews are as dark as Arabs.
It's intrinsic to Western history. So the idea that Americans...
It's intrinsic to Western history. Bro, oh God. God, that 20% Arab population in Israel are really fucking... They're really on the brink now, aren't they? Any day now, it's intrinsic to Europeans to get rid of them. Any day now.
or Brits or the French would have an issue with. I mean, French
This
has
is
been,
he thinks it's the same. He thinks it's exactly the same as an imperial superpower settler colony. That's what he thinks. Okay, nice one. Good.
doing it in Algeria for decades. The Americans have been doing it in North America for centuries. So how would Israel forcibly displacing Palestinians somehow besmirch Israel in the eyes of the West?
Even in the 1944 resolution of the Labor Party, and at the time even Bertrand Russell was a member of the Labor Party, it endorsed transfer of Arabs out of Palestine. As Mouin's pointed out, that was a deeply entrenched idea in Western thinking, that there was nothing, it doesn't in any way contradict or violate or breach any moral values to displace the Palestinian population. Now, I do believe there's a legitimate question. Had it been the case, as you said, Professor Morris, that the Zionists wanted to create a happy state with a Jewish majority, but a large Jewish minority. And if by virtue of immigration, like in our own country, given the current trajectories, non-whites will become the majority population in the United States quite soon. And according to democratic principles, we have to accept that. So if that were the case, I would say maybe there's an argument that had there been mass Jewish immigration, changed the demographic balance in Palestine, and therefore Jews became the majority. You can make an argument in the abstract that the indigenous Arab population should have been accepting of that, just as whites in the United States, quote unquote whites, have to be accepting of the fact that the demographic majority is shifting to non-whites in our own country. But that's not what Zionism was about. I did write my doctoral dissertation on Zionism, and I don't want to get now bogged down in abstract ideas. But as I suspect you know, most theorists of nationalism say there are two kinds of nationalism. One is a nationalism based on citizenship. You become a citizen, you're integral to the country. That's sometimes called political nationalism. And then there's another kind of nationalism, and that says the state should not belong to its citizens, it should belong to an ethnic group. Each ethnic group should have its own state. It's usually called the German Romantic idea of nationalism. Zionism is squarely in the German Romantic idea. That was the whole point of Zionism. We don't want to be Bundists and be one more ethnic minority in Russia. We don't want to become citizens and just become a Jewish people in England or France. We want our own state.
Like the Arab 23 states.
No, wait. Before we get to the Arabs, let's stick to the Jews for a moment, or the Zionists. We want our own
As
state.
always.
And in that concept of wanting your own state, the minority at best lives on sufferance and at worst gets expelled. That's the logic of the German Romantic Zionist idea of a state. That's why they're Zionists. Now, I personally have shied away from using the word Zionism ever since I finished my doctoral dissertation. Because
Was that painful?
Because as I said, I don't believe it's the operative ideology today. It's like talking about Bolshevism and referring to Khrushchev. I doubt Khrushchev could have spelled Bolshevik. But for the period we're talking about, they were Zionists. They were committed to their exclusive state with a minority living on sufferance or at worst expelled. That was their ideology. And I really feel there's a problem with your happy vision of these Western Democrats like Weizmann, and they wanted to live peacefully with the Arabs. Weizmann described the expulsion in 1948 as, quote, the miraculous clearing of the land. That doesn't sound like somebody shedding too many tears at the loss of the indigenous population.
Let me respond to the word
Let him
unsufferance.
respond.
The unsufferance I don't agree with. I think that's wrong. The Jewish state came into being in 1948. It had a population which was 20% Arab when it came into being after Arab refugees. Many of them had become refugees, but 20% remained in the country. 20% of Israel's population at inception in 1949 was Arab.
80% went missing.
No. We're talking about what remained in Palestine, Israel, after it was created. The 20% who lived in Israel received citizenship and all the rights of Israelis, except, of course, the right to serve in the army, which they didn't want to. And they have Supreme Court justices, they have Knesset members. They enjoy
they lived under emergency laws until 1966.
For a period, sure. They lived under.
So they didn't immediately have citizenship.
No, wait a
This is
second. At the beginning, it's not fantasy. At the beginning, they received citizenship, could vote in elections for their own people, and they were put into parliament. But in the first years, the Israeli, the Jewish majority suspected that maybe the Arabs would be disloyal because they had just tried to destroy the Jewish state. Then they dropped the military government and they became fully equal citizens. So if the whole idea was they must have a state without Arabs, this didn't happen in 49, and it didn't happen in the
Then why did you say Professor Morris,
Yes.
then why did you say
Transfer
without a population
was inevitable.
expulsion,
Oh, yeah.
a Jewish state would not have been established?
Because you're missing the first section of that paragraph, which was that they were being assaulted by the Arabs. And as a result, a Jewish state could not have come into being unless there had also been an expulsion of the population which was trying to kill them.
Norm, I'm officially forbidding you referencing that again.
I think.
Hold on a second, wait. We responded to it. So the main point you're making, we have to take Benny at his word, is like there was a war, and that's the reason why he made that statement.
I think that just one last point on this. I remember
No, let's
reading
not
your
talk
book
about that.
when it first came out, and reading.
It's so I feel like it's just such an obvious distinction, but okay.
One incident after the other and one example after the other, and then getting to the conclusion.
But apparently
where-
it doesn't matter, because if there's no war and no rejection of the partition plan or none of that, then it would have happened anyway, because they're white, because they're European. And that's just what Europeans do. Fuck me.
You said the Nakba was a product of war, not design. I think we were, and I remember reacting almost in shock to that I felt you had mobilized overwhelming evidence that it was a product of design, not war. And I think our discussion today very much.
LonerBox Netanyahu once said Israel is not a country for its citizens, it's a country for the Jewish people. Yeah, I know Netanyahu said that, because Netanyahu is a far right, like a right-wing piece of shit. Well, yeah. Because I think Netanyahu might be a little bit racist, among other things.
Much reflects, let's say, the dissonance between the evidence and the conclusion. You don't feel that the research that you have conducted and published demonstrates that it was in fact inherent and inbuilt and inevitable. And I think the point that Norm and I are making is that your own historical research, together with that of others, indisputably demonstrates that it does. I think that's a fundamental disagreement we're having here.
Can I actually respond to that? Because this is actually, I think this is emblematic of the entire conversation. I watched a lot of Norm's interviews and conversations in preparation for this, and I hear Norm will say this all over and over and over again. I only deal in facts. I don't deal in hypotheticals. I only deal in facts. I only deal in facts.
Facts.
And that seems to be the case, except for when the facts are completely and totally contrary to the particular point you're trying to push. The idea that Jews would have out of hand rejected any state that had Arabs on it or always had a plan of expulsion is just betrayed by the acceptance of the 47 partition
I don't
plan.
think you understand politics. Did I just say that there is a chasm that separates your ideology from the limits and constraints imposed by politics and reality? Now, Professor Morris, I suspect, would agree that the Zionist movement from fairly early on was committed to the idea of a Jewish state. I am aware of only one major study, probably written 40 years ago, the binational idea in mandatory Palestine by a woman. I forgot her name now. You remember her.
I'm trying to.
Yeah, okay, but you know the book.
I think so.
Yeah, she is the only one who tried to persuasively argue that the Zionist movement was actually, not formally, actually committed to the binational idea. But most historians of the subject agree the Zionist movement was committed to the idea of a Jewish state. Having written my doctoral dissertation on the topic, I was confirmed in that idea because Professor Chomsky, who was my closest friend for about 40 years, was very committed to the idea that binationalism was the dominant trend in Zionism. I couldn't go with him there. But Professor Morris, you are aware that until the Biltmore Resolution in 1942, the Zionist movement never declared it was for a Jewish state. Why? Because it was politically impossible at the moment until 1942. There is your ideology, there are your convictions, there are your operative plans, and there's also separately what you say in public. The Zionist movement couldn't say in public, we're expelling all the Arabs. They can't say that. And they couldn't even say we support a Jewish state until 1942.
You're conflating two things. The Zionists wanted a Jewish state,
Yes.
correct? That didn't
That
mean
didn't mean
expulsion of the
that's what I'm
Arabs.
saying, yeah.
It's not the same thing. They wanted a Jewish state with a Jewish majority, but they were willing, as it turned out, both in 37 and in 47, and subsequently, to have an Arab minority,
it was
a large
transfer.
Arab
In 37,
minority.
there was a
They were
transfer.
willing to have a large Arab minority
come
in the
on.
country, and they ended up with a large Arab minority in the country. 20% of the
They
population
ended
in
up-
49
they
was
ended
Arab,
up-
and it's still
They ended up for
21%.
about 5 minutes before they were expelled. They agreed to it
No,
until
no.
47, and then they were gone by March 1949.
No,
What happened in between the rejection of the partition plan and the expulsion of the Arabs?
The Arabs launched a war.
Well, yeah, I
That's
mean, like,
what-
it wasn't random. Like, there's a potential
I
that
agree, it
even
wasn't random.
there was-
I totally agree with that.
Yeah,
It
but
was by design.
You can
It
say
wasn't
that.
random.
You can say that, but in this case, the facts betray you. There was no Arab acceptance of anything that would have allowed for a Jewish state to exist. Number
not.
one, and number two, I think that it's entirely possible, given how
It's
things.
difficult here because Finklestein is kind of saying that the Arabs could have done well to accept it, but Mouin keeps on saying, of course they didn't and they shouldn't have. Yeah, I don't know.
Happen after war, that this exact same conflict could have played out and an expulsion would have happened without any ideology at play. That there was a people that disagreed on who had territorial rights to a land. There was a massive war afterwards, and then a bunch of their friends invaded after to reinforce the idea that the Jewish people in this case couldn't have a state. There could have been a transfer regardless.
Anything could have been. That's not what history is about.
History is about Palestinian rejection.
They are talking about what would have happened, though. Because Mouin's argument is that it wouldn't have mattered if the partition plan was accepted or not.
Peace deal.
As I
over
said,
and over and
as
over
I
again.
said, when the ball was thrown into the court of the United Nations, they were faced with a practical problem. And I, for one, am not going to try to adjudicate the rights and wrongs from the beginning. I do not believe that if territorial displacement and dispossession was inherent in the Zionist project, I do not believe it can be a legitimate political enterprise. Now, you might say, that's speaking from 2022 or 2024 now.
I think.
Okay, but we have to recognize that from nearly the beginning, for perfectly obvious reasons, having nothing to do with anti-Semitism, anti-Westernism, anti-Europeanism, but because no people that I am aware of would voluntarily cede its country. You can perfectly understand Native American resistance to Euro-colonialism. You can perfectly well understand it without any anti-Europeanism, anti-whiteism, anti-Christianism. They didn't want to cede their country to invaders. That's completely understandable.
You're minimizing the anti-Semitic element
You minimized
in Arab
in
nationalism.
all your books. You minimized.
No. Husseini was an anti-Semite, the leader of the Palestinian national movement.
Hey, he says it like I do, anti-Semite. He says it the British way. Hey, I'm not alone, you fucking retard. Every time I say anti-Semite, I see like a million people in chat. Semite with like, yeah, I'll keep saying it. Fuck you. Okay.
In the 30s and 40s was an anti-Semite. This was one of the
this
things.
partition part lasts another half hour. What the fuck are they going to keep saying about? Then it's October 7th, then it's Gaza, then it's peace. Okay.
Drove him, and also drove him in the end to work in Berlin for Hitler for 4 years, with giving Nazi propaganda to the Arab world, calling on the Arabs to murder the Jews. That's what he did in World War II. That's the leader of the Palestinian Arab national movement.
Why is it,
and he wasn't alone. He wasn't
Professor
alone.
Morris, why is it that if you read your book, Righteous
Morris.
Victims, you can read it and read it and read it and read it, as I have, you will find barely a word about the Arabs being motivated by anti-Semitism.
It exists, though.
He does mention the anti-Semitism. He mentions like the peculiarity of, especially the factor that, as well as the dispossession, which made the Arabs like very understandably angry. He does also mention that it also came from people who, it was one of the probably the only colonial movements where the people who were doing the colonizing and the people who were living there already both viewed the other as inferior. Because to the Arabs and to the Muslim population especially, the Jews coming here and doing this were dhimmis. They were supposed to be like lesser for being Jews. And he also mentions the anti-Semitism of al-Husseini quite a lot and his support for the Nazis. So he does mention anti-Semitism in it. Obviously accelerated and amplified the dissatisfaction that Arabs were feeling during the time. Doesn't mean it's the only reason. It's just that it was part of it. Yeah, he does mention that. Like Finkel's got memory issues. Who knows?
Say it doesn't exist.
You agree that it exists.
Hey, I don't know a single non-Jew who doesn't harbor anti-Semitic
We're talking
sentiment.
about Arabs now.
Yeah, but I don't know anybody. That's just part of the human condition. Just
Anti-Semitism.
Husseini was a force
And among the Arabs.
So, Professor Morris, here's my problem. I didn't see that in your Righteous Victims. Even when you talked about the first Intifada, and you talked about the second Intifada, and you talked about how there was a lot of influence by Hamas, the Islamic movement, you even stated that there was a lot of anti-Semitism in those movements, but then you went on to say, but of course, at bottom, it was about the occupation. It wasn't about, and I've read it.
Yeah, but you're moving from different
No, I'm not moving.
ages, across
I'm
the ages.
talking about your whole book.
The
Your whole
occupation
book.
began in
I looked-
67, the one
I
you're
looked-
talking about.
I looked and looked and looked for
Hey, you're
evidence of
speeding
this
up.
anti-Semitism as being a chief motor of Arab resistance to Zionism. I didn't see it.
You like
Did he make that claim?
I don't remember the word chief.
Yeah,
It's one of the elements.
Very binary.
It's one of the
thinking,
elements.
like,
Binary.
Yes, binary.
Please don't give me this postmodernism binary. You're the
No, but you
one.
are thinking in terms
You're
of
the
What
one
does
that
that have
said.
to do with postmodernism? Oh no.
The
Because
chief
Stephen has a
motor.
point.
Do you have your book
You
here?
talk about
Page
black-
137.
you talk in black and white
Page
color.
137 from Righteous Victims. I can totally see why Finkelstein is so impressive to someone who doesn't really know that much because of this like autistic fucking page number memorized. He doesn't even have that written down, does he? He just remembers page 37. It must be very impressive. Where did he say on page 37? 137. Is it here? Or he says, did you say 37? This is just about, I don't think this is about anything relevant. Havlaga, pure defense changed to aggressive defense. This was like when the Haganah doctrine changed during the Arab Revolt. Irgun throwing bombs. Oh yeah, this is the whole we learned bombing from the Jews. Okay, no, this is nothing to do with. Okay, whatever.
37.
You're talking in black and white concepts when
37,
history is much
right.
grayer. Lots of things happen because of lots of reasons, not one or the other. And you don't seem to see that.
Can I ask you a question? Because it's for them to talk to. Just a very quick question. What do you think the ideal solution was on the Arab side from 47? What would they have preferred? And what would
they were
happen if,
explicit.
and then the second one, what would have happened if Jews would have lost the war in 48? What do you think would have happened to the Israeli population?
Well,
Jewish population?
I think the Palestinians and the Arabs were explicit that they wanted a unitary, I think, federal state, and they made their submissions to UNSCOP. They made their appeals at the UN General Assembly.
What do you mean by unitary and federal? I don't get that. They wanted an Arab state. They wanted Palestine to be an Arab state.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
they just wanted Jews to be a minority. They didn't want anything federal. What the fuck are you? Whoa, was this the? This might have been General Secretary. Was it Azam Al Pasha or whatever the fuck he's called? I think he was the one who said that he wanted Jews to live in kind of like autonomous zones. Well, how again, like an Arab state run by Al Husseini? Were we going to expect like a third of the population who were Jewish to accept that? Fuck.
Simply,
But I
that
think-
word unitary federal. They wanted Palestine
Yes, but
as
I
an
think-
Arab and exclusively Arab state.
No, it wasn't
That's what they wanted.
it wasn't an exclusively Arab state. I think we have to distinguish between Palestinian and Arab opposition to a Jewish state in
Was it
Palestine
Alami as well? Okay.
on the one hand, and
But again, I don't know if Alami is the same, but I think even Ben Gurion said about the General Secretary of the Arab League, he said that he was like one of the most exceptionally kind or whatever Arabs. Like he saw him as like a, kind of like an outlier. I don't think the consensus was going to be this kind of like federalized system. It's just Mouin trying to project like
Palestine.
if there was an Arab state across all of Palestine, it would have come under Al Husseini, wouldn't it? It would have come under the Arab High Committee. Or, I don't know. He wasn't in the country, though, so who would have...
Palestinian and Arab attitudes to Jewish existence in Palestine. There's a fundamental
Well,
difference.
Husseini, the leader of the movement, said that all the Jews who had come since 1917,
Yeah.
and that's the majority of the Jews in Palestine in 1947,
Yeah.
shouldn't be there.
Well, he
They
did
shouldn't
say-
be citizens and they shouldn't be there.
He did say that.
Yes,
Yes,
they
I'm
said
not
the same.
denying
Yes,
it. Of
PLO
course,
also said
it's
that.
true. I can understand.
Can you help me square the idea of a Jewish state, but trust me, bro, Arabs and all other minorities have equal rights? Yeah, you can, because when they say Jewish, they mean ethnic majority. Yeah. The same way that technically, what would you say about... That's what they mean by Jewish state. I don't know where the confusion is. It's not impossible. Want me to come in? No, leave me alone. Fuck.
Yeah, the sentiment, but I think it's wrong.
But also,
I
you guys are the
understand.
ones.
We agree
You
on
guys,
this. I also-
I want to answer
you
your
guys are like
question.
What happens if they're not a Jewish majority? Do they enforce birth quotas? I don't know. Then what happens to every other like Islamic country if they if they fear that because of immigration or because of refugees that their demographics change? In Lebanon, what they do if they have a bunch of refugees arriving from Syria and Palestine, they just don't give them citizenship. Right? Yeah, there are problems. Yeah, but that was why from 55-45 demographic, they planned on bringing in 1 million Jews. So they would have just encouraged immigration. And again, you can say there are problems with that. You can say, well, I guess I know your head right now. You've got fucking alarm bells screaming ethno-state and all that shit. But at the end of the day, there are certain like minority groups that have a bit more justification for wanting to be an ethnic majority in a country than other ones do. The same thing for the Palestinians. That's why if Israel started ramming fucking, like if Israel started this policy and were able to actually get just like every Jew in the world to come to historic Palestine, then a one-state solution would be the last fucking thing Arabs want, because it would basically make them an ethnic minority and they would never be able to pursue justice or to build a state in their image or anything like that.
you used the words earlier that it was supremacy and exclusivity that the
Well,
Zionist
I want
state
to
was
answer
built
your
on,
question. As you Husseini did say that, and I'm sure there was a very substantial body of Palestinian Arab public opinion that endorsed that.
I thought Israel is supposed to be the morally superior side. Why hold them to the same standard as Arabs? When would I ever argue that Israel is the morally superior side? What the fuck? When have I ever argued that? Well, as a culture? As an ethnicity? No. Where are you getting that from?
But by the same token, I think a unitary Arab state, as you call it, or a Palestinian state, could have been established with arrangements, with guarantees to ensure the security and rights of both communities. How that would work in detail had been discussed and proposed, but never resolved. And again, I think, Jewish fears about what would
A
have
second
happened.
Holocaust. That's what we're
Well,
talking
no,
about.
I think
that was the Jewish fear. A
Well,
second
that-
Holocaust.
that may well have been the Jewish fear. It was an unfounded Jewish fear.
It was unfounded?
Of course, it was unfounded.
What about like in
But
48 and 56?
You really think that the Palestinians, had they won the war, were going to import ovens and crematoria
I don't know,
from
it would have been
Germany?
that bad,
and,
but there
and
were
no,
pogroms
it's-
across in almost every single Arab state where there were Jews living after 48, after 56, after 67. There were always pogroms. There were always flights from Jews from those countries to Israel afterwards. I don't think it would be.
I wouldn't say there were always pogroms in every Arab state. I think there was flight of Arab Jews for multiple reasons. In some cases, for precisely the reasons you say. If you look at the Jewish community in Algeria, for example, their flight had virtually nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict. The issue of Algerian Jews was that the French gave them citizenship during their colonial rule of Algeria, and they increasingly became identified with French rule. And when Algeria became independent, and all the French ended up leaving out of fear or out of
It's also because the Nazis inspired a pogrom in Algeria in 34, right? Like, okay.
appointment or out of whatever, the Jews were identified as French rather than Algerian.
This is a bit of a red herring. There were pogroms in the Arab countries, in Bahrain even, where there's almost no Jews. There was a pogrom in 1947. There was a pogrom in Aleppo in 1947.
I'm not denying
there
any
were,
of that history.
Killings of Jews in Iraq and Egypt in 1948-49.
I'm not denying
but the Jews basically fled the Arab states not for multiple reasons. They fled because they felt that the governments there and the societies amid which they had lived for hundreds of years no longer wanted them.
Look, without getting into the details, I think we can both agree that ultimately a clear majority of Arab Jews who believe that after having lived in these countries for...
What's Aleppo? It's Syria. It's in Syria.
For centuries, if not millennia, came to the unfortunate conclusion that their situation had become untenable.
Yes.
I also think that we can both agree that this had never been an issue prior to Zionism and the emergence of the State of Israel. Look, I'm not...
Pogroms didn't begin with Zionism in the Arab world.
The issue is the point I raised, which is whether these
Get your
communities
book out, Mr.
have ever come
Finklestein. Look at him
to a
go.
collective conclusion that their position had become untenable in this part of the world. No, they were Arab Jews.
Well, because untenable meant there was no alternative. But with the creation of Israel, there was an alternative, right? A place where they could go and not be discriminated against or live as second-class citizens or be subject to Arab majority states. I also think it's interesting that, like, when you analyze the flight of Jewish people, and I've seen this, that it wasn't just, I agree with you, it wasn't just a mass expulsion from all the Arab states. There were definitely push factors. There were also pull factors. Now, I don't know how you guys feel about the Nakba, but when the analysis of the Nakba comes in, again, it's back to that, well, that was actually just a top-down expulsion. The retreat of wealthy Arab people in the 30s didn't matter. Any of the messaging from the surrounding Arab states didn't matter. It was just an expulsion from Jewish people or people running from their lives.
The messaging of, oh God, I'm gonna do the total Zionist argument here. The fact that the massacres at Deir Yassin were exaggerated to fuck by the Arab leaders because they were expecting it to rally people to the cause. But what it actually did, especially since it happened after a bunch of the Arab leadership and upper classes are already left, was that people were just demoralized, helpless, scared, and then they just ran away. Again, that obviously means that the people who did the massacre kind of gave people that thing to talk about, but no. But yeah, it's weird that that's always a really interesting double standard to notice, is that people are very, very nuanced about push and pull factors for one, but not the other. Traveling Israel does this the other way around. He's very nuanced. He pretends to be very nuanced about push and pull factors from the Nakba, but when it comes to the Arab states and the Jewish flight from there, he just says ethnic cleansing. That's all he says. Yeah.
From Jewish massacres. Again, it's like I feel like it's a selective critical analysis of
the term Jewish here, because it wasn't the Jews of England or the Soviet Jews.
Why I say Jewish because prior to 48, saying Israeli.
I think it's useful to say refer to Zionists before 1948 and Israelis after 48. We don't need to implicate.
Well, sure, but the Jewish people that were being attacked in Arab states weren't Zionists. They were just Jews living there. Right?
Wasn't Deir Yassin also amplified by the Jewish side to motivate people to leave? It was in part, but not nearly as much. And also, the Arabs didn't hear the messages from the Irgun, from their press releases. They heard it from Arab radio, right? The Arabs weren't listening to the Irgun's press releases. They were listening to Arab radio, yeah. But yeah, the Irgun did exaggerate it. They said that 250 people had died. They added in some fucking rapes that probably didn't happen, or that we don't know if they happened or not. Yeah, they did.
Just comment on that. I was rereading Shlomo Ben Ami's last book, and he does at the end discuss at some length the whole issue of the refugee question bearing on the so-called peace process. And on the question of 48 and the Arab emigration, if you allow me, let me just quote him. Israel is particularly fond of the awkwardly false symmetry she makes between the Palestinian refugee crisis and the forced emigration of 600,000 Jews from Arab countries following the creation of the State of Israel, as if it were, quote, an unplanned exchange of populations, unquote. And then Mr. Ben-Ami, for those of you who are listening, he was Israel's former foreign minister, and he's an influential historian in his own right. He says, in fact, envoys from the Mossad and the Jewish Agency worked underground in Arab countries and Iran to encourage Jews to go to Israel. More importantly, for many Jews in Arab states, the very
So again, if I was going to understand what Ben-Ami is saying there, is that I agree it's not symmetrical. Like there were a lot more direct expulsions from Palestine than there were from the Arab world when it came to Jews. It was a much more direct thing, and obviously war, the Jewish flight from the Middle East didn't happen in the context of a war. It is very different when it comes to symmetry, and also that Israel had like very much motivation to inspire Jews to come. But now I think what Finkelstein's doing is he's using that like lack of symmetry to shoulder the responsibility as much as possible onto the Mossad. Okay, yeah, because again, I don't know about you, but if a Lebanese dude came to me and was like, "Here, come to Lebanon, be like in a majority Lebanese country and shit," I'd be like, "Fuck off, dick, leave me alone." But if there had just been an anti-Lebanese pogrom just down the road from me, like a few years ago, and there was violence, and there was like my bank account was getting frozen by government, and there were like people being more threatening, intimidating to me on the streets and shit like that, then I'd probably be like, What's that you said about that Lebanese majority place where I don't have to deal with this shit? Obviously, like push and pull, right? But that pull doesn't really exist without the push.
possibility of emigrating to Israel was the culmination of millennial aspirations. It represented the consummation of a dream to take part in Israel's resurgence as a nation. So this idea that they were all expelled after 1948,
what's that book, Prophets of That
one
Water?
area, Professor Moritz, I defer to expertise. That's one of my credos in life. I don't know the Israeli literature, but as it's been translated in English, there's very little solid scholarship on what happened in 1948 in the Arab countries and which caused the Jews to leave.
Arab Jews.
Arab Jews, right. But Shlomo Ben-Ami knows the literature. He knows the scholarship.
He also
He's a
comes from
historian.
Tangiers.
Yeah,
He's from Morocco.
Right. So
You
he
have
knows
Avi Schleim
this.
from Iraq
And-
has written on this issue.
And they wrote
as well.
that the Jews in the Arab lands were not pro-Zionist. They weren't Zionists at all. So certainly Avi Schleim's family was anti-Zionist.
And Avi Schleim, when he was interviewed by Mouin Rappaport on this question, he said, you simply cannot say that the Iraqi Jews were expelled. It's just not true. And he was speaking as an Iraqi Jew who left with his father and family in 1948.
They were pushed out. They weren't expelled.
Well,
That's probably the right phrase.
I think it's more complex than that. I think it was. Sorry, I interrupted
no,
you.
you're not interrupting me because I don't
Again,
know.
the pogrom in Iraq was what, 1941? June 41. Between 180 and 1,000 Jews killed. Bam. Nazi-inspired. Oh, yeah.
I only know what's been translated into English, and the English literature on the subject is very small and not scholarly. Now, there may be a Hebrew literature, I don't know, but I was surprised that even Shlomo Ben-Ami, a stalwart of his state, fair enough, on this particular point, he called it false symmetry.
No, Stephen is right. There was a pull and a push mechanism in the departure of the Jews from the Arab lands post-48. But there was also a lot of push.
That's indisputable.
Okay,
There was.
so that's-
And on the
Stephen
point of
was saying-
agreement, on this one brief light of agreement, let us wrap up with this topic of history and move on to modern day. But before that, I'm wondering if we could just say a couple of last words on this topic. Stephen?
Yeah, I think that when you look at the behaviors of both parties in the time period around 48, or especially 48 and earlier, there's this assumption that there was this huge built-in mechanism of Zionism and that it was going to be inevitable from the inception of the first Zionist thought, I guess, that appeared in Herzl's mind, that there would be a mass violent population transfer of Arab Palestinians out of what would become the Israeli state. I understand that there are some quotes that we can find that maybe seem to possibly support an idea that looks close to that, but I think when you actually consult the record of what happened, when you look at the populations, the massive populations that Israel was willing to accept within what would become their state borders, their nation borders, I just don't think that the historical record agrees with the idea that Zionists would have just never been okay living alongside Arab Palestinians. But when you look at the other side, Arabs would out of hand reject literally any deal that apportioned any amount of that land for any state relating to Jewish people or the Israeli people. I think it was said even on the other end of the table that Arab Palestinians would have never accepted, the Arabs would have never accepted any Jewish state whatsoever. So it's interesting that on the ideology part, where it's claimed that Zionists are people of exclusion and supremacy and expulsion, we can find that in diary entries, but we can find that expressed in very real terms on the Arab side, I think in all of their behavior around 48 and earlier, where the goal was the destruction of the Israeli state. It would have been the dispossession of many Jewish people. It probably would have been the expulsion of a lot of them back to Europe. And I think that very clearly plays out in the difference between the actions of the Arabs versus some diary entries of some Jewish leaders.
Benny?
He's being, oh God, if I was Mr. Finkelstein or Mouin, I would have really, really snapped at that one because it wasn't. The gist of what he's saying is right, but it wasn't just diary entries. They said at the Zionist conferences as well. Like, they actually never went on public on the record against the idea of removing Arabs during the 30s and 40s. Ben Gurion, Weizmann, like all these people, they never spoke out publicly against it. They just spoke out in favor of it more or less subtly. They spoke about it at the Zionist congresses or at the meetings of the Jewish agencies and the Wealth Fund and everything like that, but just not in front of like British and American and French and like other imperial powers, right? Like, yeah.
Well, one thing which stood out, and I think Mouin made this point, is that the Arabs had nothing to do with the Holocaust, but then the world community forced the Arabs to pay the price for the Holocaust. That's the traditional Arab argument. This is slightly distorting the reality. The Arabs in the 1930s did their utmost to prevent Jewish immigration from Europe and reaching Palestine, which was the only safe haven available, because America, Britain, France, nobody wanted Jews anywhere, and they were being persecuted in Central Europe and eventually would be massacred in large numbers. So the Arab effort to pressure the British to prevent Jews reaching Palestine's safe shores contributed indirectly to the slaughter of many Jews in Europe, because they couldn't get to anywhere and they couldn't get to Palestine because the Arabs were busy attacking Jews in Palestine and attacking the British to make sure they didn't allow Jews to reach this safe haven. That's important. The second thing is, of course, there's no point in belittling the fact that the Arab
Benny looks like a dad who took his son to work and he's playing on his iPad. I know he's looking at his notes, but yeah, it does look like that. I feel like Benny's lost his historian hair, though. Where's his... he used to have historian hair. It's not curly enough. This is what I miss. Where's the... trying to think of a good... This. Where's the historian hair? Look at that. It's chaos. He needs that back. Where's this? Where's this dude? Or this guy? Oh, this is perfect. I'm not happy with this.
Palestinian Arab National Movement's leader, Husseini, worked for the Nazis in the 1940s. He got a salary from the German Foreign Ministry. He raised troops among Muslims in Bosnia for the SS, and he broadcast to the Arab world calling for the murder of the Jews in the Middle East. This is what he did. And the Arabs since then have been trying to whitewash Husseini's role. I'm not saying he was the instigator of the Holocaust, but he did he helped.
He has to add that in because Netanyahu acted like he was. Oh, God. I love it. I love the dumb fucking Holocaust comments that people come up with. That he's talking about Husseini, by the way, who got Bosnian Muslims to help with the Holocaust and who incited like violence and killing of Jews in the Middle East. Yeah, this guy. Yeah, who was the head of the Arab Higher Committee at the time. Whoa.
Helped the Germans along in doing what they were doing, and supported them in doing that. So this can't be removed from the fact that the Arabs, as you say, paid a price for the Holocaust, but they also participated in various ways in helping it happen.
Right.
I'll make 2 points. The first is you mentioned Haj Amin al-Husseini and his collaboration with the Nazis. Entirely legitimate point to raise. But I think one can also say definitively, had Haj Amin al-Husseini never existed, the Holocaust would have played out precisely as it did.
Certainly.
As far as Palestinian opposition to Jewish immigration to Palestine during the 1930s is concerned, it was of a different character than, for example, British and American rejection of Jewish immigration. They just didn't want Jews on their soil.
Objectively, it helped the Germans kill the Jews.
In the Palestinian case, their opposition to Jewish immigration was to prevent the transformation of their homeland into a Jewish state that would dispossess them. And I think that's an important distinction to make. The other point I wanted to make is we've spent the past several hours talking about Zionism, transfer, and so on. But I think there's a more fundamental aspect to this, which is that Zionism, I think, would have emerged and disappeared as yet one more utopian political project, had it not been for the British, what the preeminent Palestinian historian Walid Khalidi has termed the British Shield. Because I think without the British sponsorship, we wouldn't be having this discussion today. The British sponsored Zionism for a very simple.
What is this Piers Morgan thing? Has Piers Morgan actually become the first guy to bring Twitch poll into mainstream TV? Who are these dudes? Who are these two? Comet Dave Smith. He's a libertarian. Okay. Cool. All right.
Reason, which is that during World War I, the Ottoman armies attempted to march on the Suez Canal. Suez Canal was the jugular vein of the British Empire, between Europe and India. And the British came to the conclusion that they needed to secure the Suez Canal from any threat. And as the British have done so often in so many places, how do you deal with this? Well, you bring in a foreign minority, implant them amongst a hostile population, and establish a protectorate over them. I don't think a Jewish state in Palestine had been part of British intentions. And the Balfour Declaration very specifically speaks about a Jewish national home in Palestine. In other words, a British protectorate. Things ended up taking a different course.
What the fuck is this meme? Is this... Wait. I hope... Is this anti-Semitic? Hang on, where is it? It's not coming up.
And I think the most important development was World War II. And I think this had maybe less to do with the Holocaust and more to do with the effective bankruptcy of the United Kingdom during that war and its inability to sustain its global empire. It ended up giving up India, ended up giving up Palestine. And it's in that context, I think, that we need to see the emergence of a Jewish state in Palestine. And again, a Jewish state means a state in which the Jewish community enjoys not only a demographic majority, but an uncontestable demographic majority, an uncontestable territorial hegemony, and an uncontestable political supremacy. And that is also why,
is it because I'm not
after
logged into
1948, the nascent Israeli state confiscated, I believe, up to 90% of lands that had been previously owned by Palestinians who became citizens of Israel. It is why the new Israeli state imposed a military government on its population of Palestinian citizens between 1948 and 1966.
Hey.
It is why the Israeli state effectively reduced the Palestinians living within the Israeli state as citizens of the Israeli state to second-class citizens. On the one hand, promoting Jewish nationalism and Jewish nationalist parties. On the other hand,
I'll be really quick. Look, is this anti-Semitic? I can't. No.
everything within its power to suppress and eliminate Palestinian or Arab nationalist movements. And that's why today there's a consensus among all major human rights organizations that Israel is an apartheid state. What the Israeli Human Rights Organization, B'Tselem, describes a regime of Jewish supremacy between the river and the sea.
You're really tempting a response from the other side on the last few sentences. We'll talk about the claims of apartheid and so on. It's a fascinating discussion. We need to have it. Norm?
On the question of the responsibility of the Palestinian Arabs for the Nazi Holocaust, direct or indirect, I consider that an absurd claim. As Gromyko said, and I quoted him, the entire Western world turned its back on the Jews. To somehow focus on the Palestinians strikes me as completely ridiculous. Number two, as Mouin said, there's a perfectly understandable reason why Palestinian Arabs wouldn't want Jews, because in their minds, and not irrationally, these Jews intended to create a Jewish state which would quite likely have resulted in their expulsion. I'm a very generous person. I've actually taken in a homeless person for 2.5 years. But if I knew in advance that that homeless person was going to try to turn me out of my apartment, I would think 10,000 times before I took him in. Okay? As far as the actual complicity of the Palestinian Arabs, if you look at Raoul Hilberg's 3-volume classic work, The Destruction of the European Jewry, he has in those 1,000+ pages one sentence on the role of the Mufti of Jerusalem. And that, I think, is probably an overstatement, but we'll leave it aside. The only 2 points I would make aside from the Holocaust point is, number one, I do think the transfer discussion is useful because it indicates that there was a rational reason behind the Arab resistance to Jewish or Zionist immigration to Palestine, the fear of territorial displacement and dispossession. And number two, there are 2 issues. One is the history, and the second is being responsible for your words. Now, some people accuse me of speaking very slowly, and they're advised on YouTube to turn up the speed 2 to 3 times whenever I'm on. One of the reasons I speak slowly is because I attach value to every word I say.
Oh my,
and
shut
it is
the fuck up, dude.
discomforting, disorienting, where you have a person who's produced a voluminous corpus, rich in insights and rich in archival sources, who seems to disown each and every word that you pluck from that corpus by claiming that it's either out of context or it's cherry picking. Words count. And I agree with Lex. Everybody has the right to rescind what they've said in the past. But what you cannot claim is that you didn't say what you said.
I'll stick to the history, not the current propaganda. 1917, the Zionist movement began way before the British supported the Zionist movement for decades. In 1917, the British jumped in and issued the Balfour Declaration supporting the emergence of a Jewish national home in Palestine, which most people understood to mean eventual Jewish statehood in Palestine. Most people understood that in Britain and in Israel, among the Zionists and among the Arabs. But the British declared the Balfour Declaration, or issued the Balfour Declaration, not only because of imperial self-interest, and this is what you're basically saying. They had the imperial interest, a buffer state which would protect the Suez Canal from the east. The British also were motivated by idealism, and this incidentally is how Balfour described the reasoning behind issuing the declaration. And he said, the Western world, Western Christendom, owes the Jews a great debt, both for giving the world and the West, if you like, values, social values as embodied in the Bible, social justice and all sorts of other things, and the Christian world owes the Jews because it persecuted them for 2,000 years. This debt we're now beginning to repay with the 1917 declaration favoring Zionism. But it's also worth remembering that the Jews weren't proxies or attached to the British imperial endeavor.
I thought Balfour hated Jews. Well, that's because you learn about it from fucking left-wing TikToks. That's why you think Balfour hated Jews. It's wrong. That's why that fucking quote about Britain shouldn't or European countries allowing a potentially hostile population, or he even says it in the quote. Balfour Jews considered hostile, quote. Where's the quote? Balfour was anti-Semitic in the sense that he fucking loved Jews. He was anti-Semitic in the sense that he thought Jews were fucking awesome, basically. He thought they were like the greatest race and that they'd been so resilient to tolerate the 2,000 years of European anti-Semitism. He felt like Britain owed them a massive debt for all of Europe's sins. And he thought that like Jews were basically justified in their hostilities towards European countries. Yeah, he was a philo-Semite. Yeah. Let me see. Is this where's the quote? Hostile? Al Jazeera probably quoted out of context as well. This is the quote that everyone uses. For as I read its meaning, it is, among other things, a serious endeavor to mitigate the age-long miseries created for Western civilization by the presence in its midst of a body which is too long regarded as alien and even hostile, but which it was equally unable to expel or absorb. Surely, for this, if no other reason, it should receive our support. So 2 things here. One is he is addressing this to other European countries, most of whom are anti-Semitic, to get them to support Zionism. That's what he's trying to get them to do. Even within this quote, this is what Sean really pissed me off when he did with his video, because in Sean's video, he tried to make it sound like this is the same as like Richard Spencer level shit, right? Like only supporting Zionism as a way to keep the dirty Jews out. But that's not what he's saying. What he's saying, and you can even see here, too long regarded as alien and hostile, as in Balfour believes that the way that Europe treated Jews was immoral. He detested the way that Europe had treated European Jews over the centuries. But he also believed that because of the way Europe had treated its Jewish population, the Jews had, in his mind, understandably decided that they were never going to owe any loyalty to any European state, like ever, as a group. That's what he believed. He believed that Europe was never going to treat Jews as real equals, even after emancipation. Obviously, you had like German anti-Semitic mobs, you had fucking Dreyfus. He thought that Europe was never going to grow to accept the Jews, but also Jews would be right not to expect it from Europe. And he's saying that it'll be the best for both of us. It'll be best for these like anti-Semitic Europeans and also best for Jews if they can have a homeland somewhere else. That's what he's saying there. So when people try to use this as a kind of like, we support Zionism as a way of getting them out, it's so you can have your moral issues with Balfour. Balfour, like by today's standards, was not like a decent dude, right? He was a big fucking arch imperialist and shit. But at the end of the day, people who use this quote are, first of all, they're deliberately misreading the quote where he's clearly saying too long regarded as in like by other people, right? But he's also, they're just not capturing the spirit of this message at all. Like you can read the whole message. There are loads of websites that have the whole thing. It's like maybe 15, 20-minute read, maybe even less. But yeah, that's Balfour's attitude towards supporting Zionism. Well, one, him and Lloyd George and other people in the cabinet believed that Jews were more powerful than they were. They thought that if they supported Zionism, Jews would help them out in World War I in a much more meaningful way than they actually did, because he thought they had more financial power. But Balfour, if you go through all his writing, like the real reason, and the one that he repeats over and over and over and over and over again, is that he felt that Europe had betrayed Jewish people, had mistreated them for 2,000 years, and he believed that Europe owed them something. And Zionism, the Jewish state, was his answer to that. He was an idealist. That's why he supported it. Right. Anyway, fucking. Okay.
They were happy to receive British support in 1917, and then subsequently when the British ruled Palestine for 20, 30 years, but they weren't part of the British imperial...
Which is also very interesting that the people who fucking tore up that Balfour painting, because I'm honestly going to assume that none of them actually knew that, but whatever.
Design or mission. They wanted a state for themselves, the Jews, happy to have the British support them, happy today to have the Americans support Israel. But it's not because we're stooges or extensions of American imperial interests. The British, incidentally, are always described in Arab narratives or propaganda as consistent supporters of Zionism. They weren't. The first British...
Europe owed the Jews, so it paid with yet another people's land, classic Europe. Well, yeah, that's the more valid criticism of Balfour. Yeah, okay.
Rulers in Palestine, 1917, 1920.
Herbert Samuel.
No, before Herbert Samuel. Samuel came in 1920. The British ruled there for 3 years previously, and most of the leaders, the British generals and so on, who were in Palestine, were anti-Zionist. And subsequently, in the 20s and 30s, the British occasionally curbed Zionist immigration to Palestine, and in 1939 switched horses and supported the Arab national movement and not Zionism. They turned anti-Zionist and basically said, you Arabs will rule Palestine within the next 10 years. This is what we're giving you by limiting Jewish immigration to Palestine. But the Arabs didn't actually understand what they were being given on a silver platter, Husseini again, and he said, no, we can't accept the British White Paper of May 1939, which had given the Arabs everything they wanted, basically, self-determination in an Arab majority state. So what I'm saying is the British, at some point, did support the Zionist enterprise, but at other points were less consistent in the support, and in 1939, until 1948, when they didn't vote even for partition, for Jewish statehood in Palestine, in the UN resolution, they didn't support Zionism during the last decade of the mandate. It's worth remembering that.
I'd like to respond to that. I mean, speaking of propaganda...
Oh, I thought these were closing statements.
I find it simply impossible to accept that Balfour, who, as British Prime Minister in 1905, was a chief sponsor of the Aliens Act, which was specifically...
He changed his mind.
Which was specifically designed to keep
The Aliens Act is earlier. Yeah, this is Balfour's whole thing, was his big revelation and shit like that. Aliens Act was 1905, no? So yeah, it was like 12 years before. Yeah, okay.
Executed Eastern European Jews out of the streets of the UK,
mind.
and who was denounced as an anti-Semite by the entire British Jewish establishment. A decade later, all of a sudden...
Changed his mind.
People change their minds.
How is a decade all of a sudden, bro? Fuck me. It's just as well I wasn't streaming a decade ago, because I was a fucking moron.
But when the changing of the mind just coincidentally happens to coincide with the British imperial interest, I think perhaps the transformation is a little more superficial than he's being given credit for. It was clearly a British imperial...
Does he know that? I don't actually know how the change of heart took place. Does Mouin know what Balfour was doing between 1905 and 1917? Were you tanky adjacent 10 years ago? I was never really that... No. I don't think I ever really bought into any. I always thought that, like, because I was a big Zizek fan, and the thing with Zizek was that he would always try to pitch this thing that socialists and communists basically just want what liberals want, but more. Like, I don't know, more equal opportunity, more fucking agency in your workplace and all that kind of shit. So I never really bought the whole like sacrifice liberal values of freedom or equality or like free speech and all that for like some greater good of like elevating the working class or something, because it just never seems to go well when they do that. So no, I never really fell into the tanky stuff. Although the problem is, and I've noticed this with a lot of people, is that you might not ever be a tanky, but you will adopt tanky narratives of certain things. Because if you're a socialist and you consider yourself, even if you're a socialist who's quite friendly to liberal democratic values, you're probably still going to get a lot of your information from socialist sources. And a lot of socialist sources often just regurgitate like Soviet propaganda, or just are coming to you from tankies, I guess, who are a bit more fucking clever with how they hide their actual intentions. So that's the thing I have to be quite mindful of as well, is often when you see like a red flag for someone being a proper like Marxist-Leninist authoritarian, is they might actually just believe a couple of tidbits here and there that came from those persuasions, but they don't actually believe the overall ideology itself. Like Hassan, yes.
Venture.
Who has admitted on the Deprogram podcast that he waters down his messaging to serve as an earlier stage of the pipeline. Yeah.
And if there had been no threat to the Suez Canal during World War I, regardless of what Balfour would have thought about the Jews and their contribution to history and their persecution and so on, there would have been no Balfour
Can I ask real quick a question on that? Why did the British ever cap immigration then from Jews to that area at all?
Well, we're talking now about 1970s.
Sure, but I'm saying that if the whole goal was just to be an imperialist project, like there were terrorist attacks from Jewish.
Yes, but you're talking. I'll answer.
Yeah, in the 40s. Yeah,
and we're talking now about 1917, and as I mentioned earlier, I don't think the British had a Jewish state in mind. That's why they used the term Jewish national home. I think what they wanted was a British protectorate, loyal to and dependent upon the British. I think an outstanding review of British policy towards these issues during the Mandate has been done by Martin Bunton of the University of Victoria, and he basically makes the argument that once the British realized the mess they were in, certainly by the late 20s, early 30s, they recognized the mess they were in, the irreconcilable differences, and basically pursued a policy of just muddling on, and muddling on in the context of British rule in Palestine.
The white paper was Chamberlain. If we're talking quotes, Chamberlain explicitly said, if we're going to offend one group here, it's going to be the Jews, not the Arabs. When they came up with the 39 white paper, I feel like it was pretty conscious betrayal of Zionism.
Whose overall purpose was to serve for the development of Zionist institutions, Yeshuv's economy, and so on, meant, even if the British were not self-consciously doing this, preparing the groundwork for the eventual establishment of a Jewish state. I don't know if that answers your question.
Except they did turn anti-Zionist in 1939.
Yes, of course.
And maintained that Zionist, no, before they were being shot off, but maintained that anti-Zionist posture until 1948.
Okay.
And if I may, just also one point, you mentioned Haj Amin al-Husseini during World, entirely legitimate. But what I would also point out is that you had a Zionist organization, the Lehi.
300 people.
300 people, one of whom happened to become an Israeli prime minister, an Israeli foreign minister, speaker of Israeli parliament.
Maybe you should give his name.
Yitzhak Shamir, proposing an alliance with Nazi Germany in 1941.
Shamir proposed?
Well, no, the Lehi proposed.
Some people in the Lehi proposed.
Of which Shamir was a prominent
leader. This is
leader.
a red herring also.
No, okay, well, if he's a red herring,
the Lehi was
a red...
We're going to compare al-Husseini to... Okay. Al-Husseini was the leader of the movement. He was the Arab Harbor Committee leader. I feel like if you're a Mouin, I could do a better job than Mouin's doing right now. You would just say al-Husseini was appointed by the British, that Palestinians could have had the Nashashibis in, because for Grand Mufti, the position, there were 4 people, 3 of them who all got more votes than al-Husseini were Nashashibis, who were more moderate. That's it. They gave it to al-Husseini to as part of a kind of like power play between the two families, but also because to appease the nationalist wing of Palestinians, of whom obviously not everyone was part of that wing. Nationalism, in the point when al-Husseini was appointed by Herbert Samuel, was basically like the ideology of the middle and upper classes, which were not many, of whom there were not many in mandatory Palestine at that time. Most of the people were illiterate, right? Fuck.
Well, I'm sorry.
The Lehi was an unimportant organization in the Yishuv. 300 people versus 30,000 belonged to the Haganah. So it was not a very important organization. It's true, before the Holocaust actually began, they wanted allies against the British where they could find them.
We're talking 1941 here, not
1940.
41 from what I recall.
1940. They approached the German emissary in Istanbul or something.
Yes.
Istanbul.
And if I may, proposed an alliance with Nazi Germany on what the Lehi described as...
His point is that Lehi were an extremist terror. I know what his point is, but his point is also to say that if the Lehi is a red herring, then so is al-Husseini. What? Like a militia of 300 people is the same level of red herring as al-Husseini, who is the leader of the movement, who was able to inspire pogroms and fucking riots and shit like that, even when he wasn't in Palestine. And who was also helping to organize fucking Muslims in Eastern Europe to kill Jews. Eek.
basis of
reviled by the
shared
regime of Zionism.
ideological
But they were- no,
ideological
they didn't share
principles.
ideological
Well, they said they did.
No,
They said.
they reviled.
Why are you doing these things? Of
the
course
Lefty
they
was
said it.
reviled
You
by the
know the
majority.
state, but
The
you
Lefty
know
was
that
reviled.
you know what the statement said on the basis of a shared ideology. Why do you say no?
Do you think
You
that the
could
lefty, wait, the
when you
lefty people
say-
were Nazis? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying
They
that.
said
You
they were.
said.
No, you saying that. Forget statements. You like to
okay.
quote things, but
I do
were
like
they
to quote
were they
things.
Nazis?
Quote facts.
Were the
You
lefty
like to quote
Nazis?
things.
That's what I'm asking.
What did he
Some of them
just say?
supported Stalin,
Did he say that the
incidentally.
basis of the pact was their agreement on ideology?
There wasn't any pact. They suggested.
I
They
said,
proposed an
wasn't it
agreement.
right? And what did the agreement say?
They wanted arms against the British. That's what they
did the
wanted.
agreement
Yeah, well, that's
say?
what Hajime Hosseini wanted also. That's what
No, but
others
they didn't.
in India...
The
and
lefty
elsewhere-
people didn't work in Berlin helping the Nazi regime.
I mean, it's what the IRA wanted also.
No, but this is what Hajime Hosseini did. You know that he was an anti-Semite. You've probably read some of his works.
Yes.
He wasn't just anti-British.
Yes,
He was also anti-Semitic.
and
They had a common ground with Hitler.
I
It's as
think
simple as that.
we can
Not
agree.
every anti-Semite is a Hitlerite.
I think we
thought
could-
that part.
Yeah, but Al-Husseini was. Oh, no.
Literally worked with the Nazis to recruit people. He wasn't just a
Yes,
guy
and
posting
he was
or...
an absolutely revolting, disgusting human being.
This I'm happy
I
to
have
hear.
no.
But the
If
problem
you
is you're
think
saying
I
Husseini
don't
was his
believe
influence. You're
that.
saying the Mufti
But
was...
I don't even understand of all the crimes you want to ascribe
He keeps looking away from destiny.
to the Palestinian people, trying to blame them directly, indirectly, or indirectly 3 times removed for the Nazi Holocaust is completely lunatic.
Hold on. Wait, there's not a... He's not blaming them for the Holocaust.
Yes,
He's saying that from the
No, no,
perspective...
no.
No. He's saying that from the perspective of Jews in the region. Palestinians would have been
That's
part
not
of the
what he's
region. That is
saying. You have
exactly
not read him.
what he said.
I've read him.
You can't even understand him. He says right here.
Believe me, I'm a lot more literate than you, Mr. Borelli.
gonna believe the guy that
You
wrote the
read
stuff.
what Wikipedia said.
That's great.
I
And you
read
don't even
Benny
speak Hebrew.
Morris.
You call yourself an Israeli historian.
I
We're all
just-
here on different ground.
I just
The
want, if I
reality
can
is-
just respond
Well,
to
no, I'm just saying that there were two
nothing
tricks.
as
That's
always.
fine. There were 2 tricks that are being played here that I think is interesting. One is you guys claim that the Leahy was trying to forge an alliance with Nazi Germany because of a shared ideology.
That's what they said.
Yeah, but hold on, no, wait.
said.
No. It's about what you said. You brought that up to imply that Zionism must be
bringing
inexorably
up a
linked.
fact.
to-
No, I'm
you're not-
sorry.
wait,
No,
hold
you're
on.
putting words in my mouth.
No. Okay, wait. Well, then what was the purpose of saying that the Leahy claimed that the Leahy who were
The reason I
a small
brought
group
it
of people that were reviled by many in Israel.
In
or
Not
Well,
many, by everybody
yeah.
practically.
Well,
They were
compare
called
that
terrorists.
so
The
reviled.
Zionist
This is
movement
really
called
good
them
work.
terrorists.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
so what was the
And
purpose
hunted
of
them.
what was
And
the
hunted
shared-
them.
shared
and
ideology
Shamir
come?
called himself a terrorist. They were so irrelevant that their leader ended up being kicked upstairs to the leader of the Israeli party.
What, like fucking... How many decades later? When did Shamir become prime minister? Like late 80s? Hang on. 83 for a year and then 86. Okay, dude. Chill. Look at the
Parliament
gays.
Israeli
to
politics
the
50
Israeli
years hence.
to Israeli foreign minister.
And Begin was
And-
also
Yes,
in
you
the
want to
Iran.
you
I mean,
want to
would-
characterize him as irrelevant as well? Go ahead.
No. Characterize him as relevant or irrelevant based on what happens decades later. The timeline matters.
Well,
The question is, what is the point of saying that the Leahy...
It's a good point, though. You think it's a good point because you're like just so fucking unbelievably biased. Your brain is just like surrounded by fucking wet sponges that like any fucking new information is going to get fucking bounced off and shit. Like, I don't know. I don't really understand this idea that it's a good point to compare the fucking Leahy to the leader of the Palestinian movement pre-48. I don't understand why 300 people versus, and comparing their connections to the Nazis, the Leahy who proposed a fucking, agreement with the Nazis because they wanted weapons versus someone who literally was staying at the fucking house of, was it Goering or one of the fucking Nazi leaders, and also running around trying to get fucking Bosnian Muslims to actually kill Jews? What the fuck are you talking about? You think that's a good comparison? Of course you do. But to anyone who hasn't fucking already devoted themselves at the level of a fucking cult member, you can even just say, I agree with this guy for the most part, but that comparison is pretty weak, okay? That is a pretty weak comparison. That is not a one-to-one comparison, okay? Soy division as well. What's the ethical difference between being in power in the 80s versus the 50s? It's not there's no, wait, okay, sorry. Either I'm miscommunicating or you need to like have a feel around to check for little cracks in your skull to see if there are bits of brain, just like fucking little brain juice just leaking out. If you feel wet, okay, if there's any wetness on your head, you're in big fucking trouble, Soy division. It's not an ethical difference. The question was how prominent were the Leahy before 1948, okay? They were not that prominent because there were only 300 people. It doesn't matter that like decades after one of them became prime minister, okay? The prominence of Leahy in the 30s is not comparable to the prominence of al-Husseini in the 30s. That's it. Okay? And also, the connection that the Leahy had with the Nazis and the level of collaboration that they engaged in with the Nazis is not comparable to the level of collaboration engaged in by al-Husseini. It is not even closely comparable. The fuck? You understand now? I need an affirmative. Thank you, Soy David. I love you. Okay, you're all right. This Christian guy is lost, though.
He tried to forge an alliance.
Why is
relevant is bringing up the Mufti of Jerusalem and trying to blame the Holocaust.
No,
the Mufti was the leader of the Palestine Arab National Movement. The Lachi was 300
and
people.
he had as much to do
Hey,
with
Benny's doing it.
the Nazi Holocaust as I did.
No, he recruited.
What? He recruited fighters, bro. What the fuck? I don't. Norman Finkel. I'm starting to understand why Finkelstein likes David Irving now. I noticed it with the way that he was characterizing the UN report on the mass sexual violence as well, on the pattern of sexual violence in October 7th, is he does this. He is just, his standards of evidence are so fluid based on which side of the narrative they fall on. But yeah, okay. 300 to 1 person. True. Yes. The Lehi were 300 people. Al Husseini was 1 dude. Checkmate. That's good.
Did people for the SS? How can you get away from that?
No, he recruited
People
soldiers.
for the SS.
He recruited soldiers in the Balkans, mostly Kosovars, which was disgusting. I have no doubt about that.
But how is that having as much to do with it as you did, Mr. Finkel? What were you doing? Where was Norman Finkelstein in 1943? Sent Himmler birthday greetings on October 6th and expressed the hope that the coming year would make our cooperation even closer and bring us closer to our common goals. Jesus. Recruiting drive of Bosnian Muslims. Berger reported that 24 to 27,000 recruits had signed up and noted that the visit of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem had an extraordinary successful impact. Extraordinarily. Hey, the Holocaust Encyclopedia has this. I didn't know it was that many. Fuck. Now that's a bit more than 300, bro. Where's Christian Varga? Where's that person? Where's the cope? I know it's difficult to see the fucking, like, which keys to type on the keyboard because of all the fucking saliva coming out as you drool over every fucking retarded comment you make, but come on, bro. It's not a good point.
But he had
He
one.
also wrote letters
He
to
got
foreign ministers
one
saying,
sentence.
"Don't let the Jews out."
I knew
The
Raoul
whole-
Can I say-
the
can I say-
Hungarian
Raoul
foreign
Hilberg.
minister,
I
the
knew
Italian
Raoul
foreign minister
Hilberg.
received
He's
letters from
soying.
Husseini
Oh, no.
during
One
the
sentence.
Holocaust.
One
During the
sentence,
Holocaust,
destruction of
don't let the
European
Jews out. Don't let the Jews out.
That's true.
I'm not saying he
That's
was a
true.
major architect
wasn't
of the
even
Holocaust.
How reliable is that web? What, the Holocaust Encyclopedia? As far as I know, for Holocaust facts, I think these guys are pretty accurate. No, wasn't Abbas part of Feta? Yeah, he was. Yeah. What does that have to do with this? Okay.
Minor.
But if
One
we're agreed
Yeah.
that Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, collaborated with the Nazis
Yes.
during World War II and
Then we have to
actively
agree
sought
that
their
the Lehi did.
sponsorship.
Yeah.
Why is it irrelevant?
And probably wanted the destruction of European Jewry.
He probably wanted a lot of things.
Okay.
Okay. If that's
Nice one. Lots of things fill lakes and rivers.
relevant, why is it irrelevant?
Also, I have never heard the claim that the Holocaust Encyclopedia is anti-Palestinian. I'm just taking your word for it. Like,
At a prime minister of Israel.
Not prime minister. In 1941, he wasn't prime minister of Israel. He was a leader of a very small terrorist group.
So do you consider
denounced as terrorists by the mainstream of Zionism.
Do you consider it irrelevant that many years ago Mahmoud Abbas wrote a doctoral thesis, which is basically
it showed
tantamount
something about Mahmoud Abbas.
Okay, but
I
this-
didn't bring it up. You're the one who's bringing
Yes,
it up.
but
That he
you
wrote
consider
things
that
belittling
relevant.
the Holocaust. That's what you're saying. The president of the Palestinian National Authority belittled the Holocaust, said it didn't happen, or only a few Jews died.
I think that's a fair characterization of
But I didn't
Mahmoud
bring it up.
Abbas. I brought it up.
Yeah.
Okay, because my question is, then why is Shamir's antecedency relevant?
He was a terrorist leader of a very small marginal group.
Who became
Hajj Amin al-Husseini
Israel-
was the head of the movement at the time.
Also, the point of bringing up
It's no
Husseini's,
comparison.
I think
There's
the point,
no
of, wait, the point of bringing up Husseini's stuff wasn't to say that he was a great further of the Holocaust. It's that he might have been a great further in the prevention of Jews fleeing to go to Palestine to escape the
Yes,
Holocaust.
but the point
that
I
was
make-
that was the point.
And I explained why I think that's not an entirely accurate characterization. And then I wanted to make another point, if it's legitimate to bring up his role during World War II, why is it illegitimate to bring up a man who
To
would
drop the equivalence is illegitimate. Someone say it. Come on.
become Israel's Speaker of Parliament, Foreign
30 years
Minister?
hence, 40 years
Yes,
hence.
why is it? And also,
He was a young
and
terrorist.
was also responsible for the murder of the United Nations' first international envoy, Bernadatti, Foki Bernadatti. Why is all that irrelevant?
he
I don't think
was.
anybody
I don't
was-
understand.
I think that the reason why he was brought up was because Jewish people in this time period would have viewed it as there was a prevention of Jews leaving Europe because of the Palestinians pressuring the British to put a curb that 75,000
but-
immigration
but
limit.
Benny
Yeah.
Moore is saying he was a young terrorist. It did sound very dismissive, didn't it? Benny Moore, stop calling literally any Palestine. He was talking about Shamir, don't Eam, you dumb. Oh, God, I love it. I love it. The fucking retarded lefty people in my chat are coming out and they are just, they're showing all their cards. He was talking about Shamir, an Israeli.
Yes, but it's not about them furthering the Holocaust or being an architect, major or minor player in the Holocaust. He was a major player in that region. So if you wanted to bring up
Benny Morris was made the specific claim that the Palestinians played an indirect role in the Holocaust.
the indirect role would have been the prevention of people escaping from
Yes,
Europe to
and my
Palestine.
response to that is, first of all, I disagree with that characterization. But second of
How
all,
can you disagree with that? They forced the British to prevent emigration of Jews from Europe and reaching safe shores in Palestine. That's what they did.
Again,
And they knew that the Jews were being persecuted in Europe.
Was
at the time.
Palestine the only spot of land on
Basically,
earth?
Yes, basically that was the problem. The Jews couldn't
Yeah, they were being rejected everywhere.
emigrate anywhere else.
What about your great friends in Britain, the architects of the Balfour
By
Declaration?
the late 1930s,
What
they
about the United
weren't happy
States?
to take in
Yeah, they weren't friends of the Jews anymore.
Jews and the
Again,
Americans.
it's condemnable on the British as well. The British and the French and everyone at the fucking Evian conference, they were all condemnable for not bringing Jews in World War II. Yeah, of course they were.
Weren't happy to take in Jews.
And why are Palestinians who were not Europeans, who had zero role in the rise of Nazism, who had no relation to any of this, why are they somehow uniquely responsible for
Because
what
they were
happened in
they
Europe
were
and
helping
uniquely
to close the
culpable?
only safe haven for Jews. That's
Oh,
all.
really? The United States wasn't a potential safe haven. The only one was Palestine.
At the
The
time.
United States had no room
No,
from
it
the
did have
Atlantic
room.
to Pacific
It did have
for
room.
Jews.
It did have room, but it didn't
So
want
that
Jews.
wasn't the
But it didn't
only
want Jews.
safe haven.
This is
But
something
shouldn't you be focusing your anger and
America
outrage?
should be blamed for not letting Jews in during the
I was
30s.
going to say, Benny needs to say that all these countries need to be blamed as well, but that doesn't let the al-Husseini off the hook, right?
Are
and
blamed,
40s.
but nobody blames them for the Holocaust.
Well,
No,
indirectly.
I've never heard it said that
Well, that's
France
because America didn't support the Holocaust. Okay.
Delano Roosevelt was indirectly responsible for the Holocaust. I never heard that. Now, maybe it's in Israeli literature because the Israelis have gone mad. Your prime minister said the whole idea of the gas
did say
chambers
that.
came from the Mufti of Jerusalem.
That's nonsense.
But
We
he
all know
said
that's
it,
nonsense.
But we also know that Netanyahu said it.
Netanyahu says so many things which are
And he
absurd
happens to
or
be the
simple
prime
lies.
minister's longest
I cannot
serving
be
prime
responsible
minister of
for them.
Israel. No,
I can't be
you're
responsible
not
for them.
responsible for them, but it is relevant that he's the longest serving prime minister of Israel.
Unfortunately, it
and
says
and
Oh, God, August, I thought you were a lefty. What the fuck? Jews expelled from 391 countries must not be their fault, LeMayo. What are you talking about? Wait, when have there been 391 countries? Okay, fucking. God, I thought you were like a retarded leftist. I didn't know you were. It's hard. I guess you can't tell the difference these days, can you? Bye-bye. Oh, God.
something about the Israeli public.
yes,
I
and he
agree.
gets
I agree.
elected not despite saying such things, but because he says
His
such
voters
things.
don't care about Haj Amin al-Husseini or Hitler. They know nothing about his
You may
voters.
well be right.
His base know nothing about anything, and he can say what he likes, and they'll say yes, so they don't care if he says these things.
You may well be right, but anyway, not to beat a dead horse, but I still don't
Let's
understand.
not beat the dead horse.
Yeah.
You're right.
I'll just conclude by saying I don't understand why the Mufti of Jerusalem is relevant.
He is relevant. He is relevant.
But
the head of the
Yitzhak
national,
Shamir
the
is not
Palestinian,
relevant.
because
I don't-
Shamir wasn't the head of the national movement. He represented 100 or 200 or 300 gunmen who were considered terrorists by the Zionist movement at the time. The fact that 30 years later he becomes prime minister, that's the crux of history.
and his
but
history
Haj
is
Amin
not-
al-Husseini was the head of the Palestine Arab National Movement at the time.
Anyway,
What can you do?
I think we're speaking past each other.
We're not.
So,
Really. I'm
there.
talking facts.
Let's move to the modern day, and we'll return to history, maybe 67.
Damn, Benny's a debate bro. I didn't know that. Benny's a fresh and fit viewer.